Now we're going to talk about a more definitive way to identify conclusions, very fail-safe. So this is called the therefore test, and it's a way of taking two statements within an argument, and as long as one of them is the conclusion and they have a support relationship between each other, you're going to figure out which one is the conclusion and which one is the premise. Note, this doesn't work if you're testing two premises against each other because they don't have a support relationship. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the text lesson, so make sure you read that. But now let's go through an example of using this test so you can see it in action. The therefore test works by using a conclusion indicator, the word therefore, and if you've got the conclusion and you properly put it into this therefore test, it's going to sound correct. If you haven't done it right and you're putting a premise in there with that conclusion indicator, therefore, it's not going to sound right. So think of this like a little test strip that you drop things into. You're going to put what you think is the premise in this premise box here, and then what you think is the conclusion, drop into this conclusion box. So let's test two statements. We'll block this one off here, and we'll test that as a premise. And then this first one here, we'll test as the conclusion. Drop them in. We'll drop this in here, and then this one goes right in here. So cavities are harmful only if the decay reaches the nerves inside the tooth, and many cavities, if left untreated, never progress to that point. Therefore, dentists should not fill a cavity unless the nerves inside the tooth are in imminent danger from that cavity. That sounded really good. So we do know that there's a support relationship from this premise to this conclusion. So if there's no other competing conclusions in here, that's going to be the main conclusion. We can do the same test with the other premise right here, this other premise. Filling a cavity in a tooth is not a harmless procedure. It inevitably damages some of the healthy parts of the tooth. Therefore, dentists should not fill a cavity unless the nerves inside the tooth are in imminent danger from that cavity. Again, that sounds correct. So we know we have the relationship right, that this premise is supporting this conclusion. At this point, you would know that this is the conclusion. Everything's pointing in that direction. Everything is supporting that. It's worth quickly seeing what happens if you reverse it and use the test strip incorrectly. You're not using it incorrectly, but by messing it up, you can see that the support relationship doesn't go in that direction. Let's try that. Dentists should not fill a cavity unless the nerves inside the tooth are in imminent danger from that cavity. Therefore, filling a cavity in a tooth is not a harmless procedure. It inevitably damages some of the healthy parts of the tooth. That doesn't sound right at all. That therefore sounds wrong when it's attached to this premise, right? Because it's a conclusion indicator. So there you know that you have the relationship screwed up. You want to flip it and then try it again. And when it sounds better, you know you have the right support relationship within this test strip. The only real difficulty in applying this concept, this therefore test, comes when there's two competing conclusions within an argument. Sometimes arguments have what's called subsidiary conclusions that are themselves real conclusions. They receive support from their own premises, but in turn, they're giving support to a bigger main conclusion. That's the only time this gets a little tricky, and we'll talk about that more in the next lesson. So read the text lesson here very carefully, get some practice using the therefore test, and we'll move on to discussing subsidiary conclusions.